"We will extra charge for toys." The flight attendant's sharp voice cut through the hum of the cabin. Her words landed like a slap, directed at a little black boy no older than 7, standing in the aisle with his small backpack and clutching a worn stuffed airplane in his arms. Passengers glanced up, some frowning in confusion, others pretending not to hear. The boy froze, wide eyes blinking in disbelief. He had never been spoken to like that before. Not about his toy, not in front of strangers. He looked down at the stuffed plane, its faded blue wings soft from years of love. To him, it wasn't luggage. It was comfort. It was home. But to the attendant, it was suddenly a problem. "Excuse me," the boy whispered, his voice trembling, as though maybe he had misheard. "You heard me," she said, tilting her head with authority. "That toy counts as an additional item. Unless you want to pay, it needs to be stowed or left behind." The boy's small fingers tightened around the toy's belly. His throat burned with the unfairness of it, but no words came out. He glanced down the rows of seats, silently begging for someone to step in, for someone to tell him this wasn't real. But the silence was heavy. Murmurs rippled through the passengers. Some shook their heads subtly, others turned back to their phones or books, unwilling to get involved. And in that silence, the boy felt himself shrink, as though the entire cabin was pressing down on his tiny frame. The hum of the engines hadn't even begun, yet his heart pounded like a drum. He'd been so excited, counting the days to this trip, bouncing with joy as he clutched his toy at the gate. Now, that joy was melting into confusion, embarrassment and fear. He took a hesitant step forward, whispering, "But it's not. It's just my toy." The attendant didn't soften. Instead, her arms crossed, her lips pressed thin. "Rules are rules, young man. You can't bring that on board without a fee. Do you understand?" The words "young man" struck him like ice. Not playful, not gentle, cold, commanding. His eyes burned. He pressed the toy tighter to his chest, hoping it would shield him from the stares, hoping it would shield him from her. A man in the aisle behind coughed uncomfortably. A woman across the row glanced at the attendant, then down at the boy, but no one said anything. The boy's world shrank to the toy in his arms and the looming figure of authority above him. A lump formed in his throat. His voice refused to come out. For a moment, he thought about letting go, about dropping the toy back into his bag, but his heart screamed against it. That toy wasn't just fabric and stuffing. It was nights of comfort when he was afraid. It was laughter on long car rides. It was his little piece of safety in a big, confusing world. And now, that world was threatening to take it away. The engines whirred louder as the last passengers boarded. The cabin lights dimmed slightly, and the doors closed. The boy stood frozen in the aisle, caught between keeping what was his and obeying someone who didn't care about the weight of a child's heart. Somewhere deep inside, a quiet spark of defiance began to flicker. He didn't know what he could do. He didn't know who would listen, but he knew this wasn't right. And so, with trembling lips, he swallowed hard and prepared to say the only word that might change everything. The word that would lead into the next chapter of this story. "Papa?" The boy's lips quivered as he lifted his gaze to the towering attendant. His voice, small and delicate, cracked the silence. "But it's just my toy. It doesn't take space. I promise." His words were soft, as if he believed reason could melt away the hardness in her tone. His innocence shone through, the kind of honesty a child could carry, untouched by the sharp edges of the world. But the attendant's expression didn't shift. Her voice grew sharper, colder. "That doesn't matter. It's still an item. Rules are rules." The contrast between the boy's pleading eyes and the woman's rigid authority painted a cruel picture. A toy wasn't being weighed here. His worth was. The boy's small hands trembled. He pressed the toy against his chest like a shield. He tried again, whispering, "I can put it in my bag. Please, I just want to hold it." The attendant's eyes narrowed. "Do you think you're special? Everyone has to follow the rules." The words cut deeper than she knew. To a child, special was something sacred. Now it was wielded like an accusation. Passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, the tension stretching across the cabin. Some wanted to step in, but fear of confrontation glued them in silence. Their silence, heavy and complicit, surrounded the boy like a cold fog. His chest rose and fell quickly. His toy was no longer just cloth and thread. It was the last line between his innocence and her indifference. He bit his lip, his eyes darting from face to face, searching desperately for someone, anyone to defend him. But every gaze fell away. The world in that moment felt enormous, and he, a child, felt unbearably small. His voice shrank into a whisper, nearly lost in the hum of the engines. "I didn't do anything wrong." But no one answered. No one reached out. And in that silence, something inside him shifted. Helplessness turned into a spark, fear into resolve. If no one would stand for him, he would have to call for the one person who always did. The boy clutched his toy tighter, his lips trembling as he prepared to speak the name that could shatter this silence. "Papa." Her voice sliced through the cabin like steel. "Either you pay for it or I take it away." The words hung in the air, heavy and merciless. Passengers stiffened in their seats, some exchanging glances, others pretending not to hear. The boy's throat tightened. His small hands clutched the stuffed airplane so tightly his knuckles turned white. He shook his head slowly, whispering, "Please, no, it's mine." But the attendant's stance grew sharper, her shadow towering over him. "Rules are rules. If you can't pay, then give it to me now." Tears welled in his eyes, blurring the harsh lines of her face. His lips quivered as he pulled the toy closer to his chest, as if shielding it from a thief. For him, this wasn't about airline policy. It was about holding on to the one thing that made him feel safe in a world suddenly so cold. The silence inside the cabin grew suffocating. No one moved. No one spoke. The only sound was the boys' uneven breaths and the steady hum of the engines beneath their feet. He looked around desperately, eyes pleading with strangers for help. His gaze met a woman in the aisle seat, her lips parted as if she might speak, but she lowered her eyes quickly, retreating into silence. A man nearby adjusted his tie, avoiding the boy's gaze. The world had shrunk into an aisle where a child fought to keep what was his, against someone who wielded authority like a weapon. The attendant leaned closer, her tone cutting deeper. "If you don't hand it over, I will take it myself." The boy's body trembled. His chest rose and fell with sharp, frightened breaths. His toy, his comfort, his anchor, was seconds away from being torn from him. A tear slipped down his cheek. His voice broke into sobs, words barely audible. "Why? I didn't do anything wrong." But there was no mercy in her eyes. The passengers shifted again, unease spreading like wildfire, but fear kept them chained to silence. No one dared to stand between the boy and the attendant. And so, surrounded by dozens of adults yet utterly alone, the boy realized he had only one choice left. His grip tightened around the toy, his lips trembled, and his voice, though small, carried a desperate weight. He whispered the only word that could bring hope into this storm. "Papa." The word slipped from his trembling lips, fragile yet piercing. "Papa." It wasn't loud. It wasn't shouted. But in the heavy silence of the cabin, it echoed like thunder. Every passenger who had been hiding behind silence now felt the weight of that single word settle deep in their chest. The little boy's voice carried both desperation and hope, an unspoken plea for the one person he believed could make the world right again. His toy was clutched tight, his tears streaking down his cheeks, but his whisper carried more power than any protest he could have made. The attendant froze for just a second, caught off guard by the sudden shift in energy. Her stern expression faltered, if only briefly, as eyes around the cabin began to move, not to her, but searching for him. Passengers leaned slightly, craning their necks, glancing up and down the rows. Whispers rippled. "Papa, where is his father?" The air itself seemed to change, thick with anticipation. The boy's chest heaved as he whispered again, this time a little louder, a little braver. "Papa." And then something stirred. A chair creaked. A shadow shifted. Somewhere behind him, a presence began to rise. The boy felt it before he saw it. The unmistakable sense of protection, of safety drawing near. His shoulders, tense with fear, seemed to ease just slightly, as though his spirit knew rescue was coming. Every eye in the cabin now waited. Would someone stand? Would someone answer the call that had broken the silence? The boy wiped his tear with the back of his hand, still clutching his toy, his gaze locked toward the aisle. He didn't need to see. He already knew. Because when a child calls for their father, the world listens for the answer. And in the very next moment, Papa would rise. The cabin fell into a hush. Every rustle, every whisper, every sound seemed to vanish as one man slowly rose from his seat. Papa. He didn't move with haste, nor did he storm forward in anger. Instead, his steps were deliberate, measured, steady. Each one carried the weight of authority, the quiet kind that doesn't need to shout to be felt. Passengers leaned back instinctively, giving him room as he stepped into the aisle. His tall frame seemed to fill the narrow space, his shoulders squared, his presence commanding. The boy's trembling slowed. He didn't even need to turn around. He could feel Papa's presence wrapping around him like a shield. The attendant's posture stiffened. For the first time, she looked unsettled. Papa's eyes locked onto her, unwavering, sharp as steel. They weren't the eyes of a man looking for a fight. They were the eyes of a protector, a father who had been summoned by his son's cry. He stopped just beside the boy, resting a firm, reassuring hand on his small shoulder. The boy pressed into his father's side, clutching his toy tighter, but no longer feeling so alone. Papa's voice came, deep and steady. A voice that didn't rise in volume, yet carried across the cabin with absolute clarity. "Would you like to explain," he said slowly, "why you believe my son's toy requires an extra charge?" The question hung heavy in the air, calm, polite, but laced with undeniable challenge. The attendant shifted uncomfortably, her authority suddenly fragile under the weight of his presence. "Sir, it's airline policy. Extra items must be paid for." Papa tilted his head slightly, his gaze unbroken. "A child's toy is not luggage. And yet you singled him out. Tell me, did you charge every other child on this flight for their belongings? Or just mine?" Gasps rippled through the passengers. The silence was no longer passive. It was turning into support. People began to nod, whisper, and watch closely. The attendant faltered, words caught in her throat. She hadn't expected to be challenged, not like this. Papa leaned forward just enough for his presence to press on her. His tear, one remained steady, but it carried the weight of judgment. "My son called for me, because you tried to take from him something that brings him comfort. I will not allow it. Not now. Not ever. The boy clung to his father's hand, his tears slowing, his chest steadying. For the first time since the ordeal began, he felt safe. And as the cabin watched, justice began to stir, not through anger, but through the undeniable force of a father's love. But the battle wasn't over yet, because at 30,000 feet, confrontation was about to escalate. The cabin trembled with a silence so sharp it could cut. All eyes locked on the man standing in the aisle, towering above the seated passengers, his presence filling the space more powerfully than the roar of the engines outside. Papa's hand rested on his son's shoulder, steady, protective, unyielding. His gaze never left the attendant. "I'll ask you again," he said, voice low yet echoing with authority. "Why do you believe my son's toy is worth charging for?" The attendant swallowed, struggling to maintain her composure. "Sir, I told you, it's airline policy. Extra items must—" Papa cut her off, his words slicing through the excuse like lightning. "Policy." He let the word linger, tasting of disbelief. "Then tell me, where was that policy when I watched other children bored with blankets, dolls, gaming consoles, even pillows? Not one of them was told to pay. Not one of them was threatened. So why my son?" The air thickened. Passengers leaned forward, heads turning, murmurs beginning to stir like distant thunder. The attendant's lips tightened. "This situation is different." Papa stepped closer, his shadow falling across her. His tone remained calm, but each word struck with the weight of justice. "No. It isn't different. Unless you mean he's different. Unless you mean my son, a little black boy, was the only one singled out." Gasps spread through the cabin. The words that everyone had been thinking were finally spoken aloud. The boy clutched his toy, his wide eyes fixed on his father, hope flickering where fear once lived. Papa's voice deepened. "You tried to strip him of dignity. You tried to humiliate him for holding on to the only comfort he knows. That is not policy. That is prejudice." The attendant's face flushed red, her authority crumbling under the weight of his accusation. She glanced toward the front of the cabin as if seeking backup, but no help came. Because the tide was shifting. Whispers grew louder. A passenger from row 12 shook her head. "He's right. I saw kids carrying all sorts of things. None of them were stopped." Another voice followed. "It's unfair. It's wrong." One by one the silence broke. Murmurs became a chorus. The cabin, once frozen in fear, began to rally, not with shouting, but with the undeniable strength of agreement. The attendant's composure cracked. She stammered, "Sir, please lower your voice." But Papa didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His calm presence overpowered everything else. "My son deserves the same respect as every child on this plane," he declared, "and I will not stand by while anyone treats him as less." The boy's tears slowed. His small frame leaned against his father, soaking in the shield of love that nothing could penetrate. The battle of dignity versus prejudice had begun, and the balance of power was no longer hers to hold. The cabin braced itself, because what came next would decide more than just a toy. It would decide the truth. It began with a single voice. From the middle rows a woman stood, her voice clear and steady. "He's right. I saw children walk on with blankets and dolls. None of them were told to pay." The silence cracked. Another passenger, a man near the window, lifted his phone. "I'm recording this. Everyone needs to see how this boy is being treated." The attendant's face paled. Authority that once felt untouchable was slipping through her hands. All around the cabin, voice was joined together, some firm, some trembling with outrage, but all echoing the same truth. "This isn't fair. He's just a child. You can't do this. The boy, who moments earlier had felt the crushing weight of being alone, now looked up in disbelief. The strangers who once turned away were now standing for him, their eyes no longer avoiding his pain, but carrying it with him. Phones rose like silent witnesses, lenses pointed straight at the confrontation. The world outside this cabin would soon see what was happening inside it, and that knowledge alone made the staff falter. Papa remained steady, a mountain unmoved. But now he was not alone. He had the strength of dozens backing his words, their murmurs swelling into a collective demand for justice. The boy clutched his toy tighter, but this time it wasn't from fear. It was from hope. His small shoulders straightened as he felt the current shift, as he realized the people around him weren't just passengers anymore. They were allies. The attendant glanced nervously toward the front, her composure unraveling as the cabin's energy grew stronger. Every second, her authority weakened under the weight of witness, under the undeniable truth spilling from every corner. The once isolated child now stood at the center of a movement that was bigger than him, bigger than his toy. It was about dignity, about fairness, about justice. And justice was no longer a whisper. It was a roar. But what would the airline do under the pressure of so many voices? The answer would come in the next moment, when accountability could no longer be avoided. The murmurs had grown too loud to ignore. Phones pointed like spotlights, capturing every second of the unfolding drama. And then, at last, a figure in a crisp uniform appeared from the front of the cabin, the airline supervisor. He walked down the aisle with quick, deliberate steps, his face carefully composed, though his eyes revealed concern. The attendant, once rigid and commanding, suddenly seemed small, shrinking as he approached. Papa stood tall, his son by his side, his hand resting firmly on the boy's shoulder. The toy was still clutched tightly, its fabric damp with tears. The supervisor raised a hand, speaking with practiced calm. "What seems to be the issue here?" Papa's voice carried the weight of every injustice in the room. "The issue," he said slowly, "is that your employee tried to charge my son for carrying a toy. A toy. And when he refused, she threatened to take it from him. Tell me, does that reflect your policy or your prejudice?" The supervisor hesitated, his eyes flicking toward the dozens of phones recording. His silence said everything. The evidence was undeniable. The passengers had become witnesses, and the truth had already left this cabin. It was in every lens, every recording. The attendant's lips parted, but no defense came. Her authority, once wielded so harshly, had evaporated. The supervisor cleared his throat. "Sir, I assure you, this was a misunderstanding. Your son may, of course, keep his toy without any charge." The words were meant to smooth things over, but they rang hollow. The boy's dignity had already been trampled. The cabin knew it. Papa knew it. Papa's eyes narrowed. His voice remained calm but unshakable. "A misunderstanding doesn't reduce a child to tears. A misunderstanding doesn't single out only one child. I will accept nothing less than a written acknowledgement and a formal apology." The supervisor shifted, uncomfortably aware of the eyes on him, of the passengers nodding in agreement, of the phones that would ensure accountability beyond this flight. Reluctantly, he nodded. "You will have it, sir. I'll make sure it's documented." The boy leaned into his father's side, relief softening his face. He still held his toy, but now it wasn't clutched in fear. It was held in quiet triumph. Justice wasn't fully won, but dignity was reclaimed. And as the supervisor led the shaken attendant away, the cabin settled into a new rhythm, one where truth had spoken louder than silence. Yet the flight was not over, and neither was the journey of healing. The storm had passed, but its echoes lingered. As the engines roared louder and the plane lifted into the clouds, the cabin finally exhaled. The tension that had gripped every seat seemed to dissolve, leaving behind a fragile calm. The boy sat pressed against his father's side, his small fingers still wrapped around his toy. But it was no longer just a stuffed airplane. It was a symbol. A reminder that even in the face of cruelty, he had worth. He had protection. He had dignity. He brushed a tear from his cheek, his eyes softening as he glanced at Papa. The man's presence radiated calm, his hand resting firmly on the boy's shoulder, steady as ever. He didn't need to say anything. His actions had already spoken volumes. Around them, passengers exchanged quiet glances. Some nodded in respect. Others offered small, reassuring smiles toward the boy. No words were needed. Each look carried the same unspoken message. You are not invisible. You are not alone. The hum of the plane filled the silence, but it wasn't heavy anymore. It was a rhythm of continuation, a reminder that the journey must go on. The boy leaned his head gently against Papa's arm, clutching his toy not from fear this time, but from pride. He wasn't just holding fabric and stuffing. He was holding a piece of himself that no one could take away. Justice had been defended, but the lesson of this moment stretched further than one child, one toy, or one flight. And as the plane soared higher into the sky, the story shifted, from confrontation to reflection, from fear to resilience. Because what remained now was the moral, the truth every witness would carry, long after they landed. High above the clouds, the world seemed smaller, quieter. But inside the cabin, the lesson of what had just unfolded was anything but small. The boy rested against his father, his toy still tucked safely in his arms. What once was just a child's comfort had transformed into something greater, a reminder that dignity is worth protecting, even when the world tries to strip it away. Passengers who had once sat silent now carried the weight of what they had witnessed. Their glances toward Papa were filled with respect, admiration, and perhaps even shame for the moments they had stayed quiet. But they also carried gratitude for being reminded of the power of one voice to awaken many. Papa, calm and steady, leaned toward his son. His words were soft but strong enough for nearby passengers to hear. Never let anyone make you feel small, son. You have worth, and you always deserve respect. The boy's eyes glistened, not from fear this time, but from pride. He nodded, holding the toy closer, as if it too had heard the promise. The cabin, though filled with strangers, now shared a bond. They had seen how silence can enable cruelty, but they had also seen how courage can break it. From a child's whisper to a father's stance, and finally, to the voices of many, justice had found its way into the skies. The plane cut through the clouds, sunlight breaking across its wings, as though even the heavens wanted to bear witness. And in that light came the final truth. Prejudice can appear anywhere in the smallest of acts, but so can hope. It only takes one voice, one word, to remind the world that love, dignity, and justice will always rise higher. The boy smiled faintly, drifting into rest, safe in his father's shadow. His toy nestled in his arms was no longer just a plaything. It was proof that he mattered. And as the passengers settled back into their journey, each carried the same unshakable moral. Silence allows injustice to live, but courage sets us free.